The podcast transcript delves into the profound implications of nearing AGI, highlighting several critical dimensions and unresolved tensions. Here's a distilled analysis. AI's imminence and uncertainty. Experts predict AGI could emerge within 2 to 3 years, surpassing human capabilities in most cognitive tasks. This acceleration challenges policymakers to address societal preparedness, as labor markets, governance, and global security frameworks are ill-equipped for such a paradigm shift. 2. Geopolitical rivalry. The US-China race for AGI dominance is framed as a technological Cold War. Export controls on advanced chips aim to curb China's progress, but risks include provoking adversarial escalation and stifling global collaboration on safety. The dilemma lies in balancing national security with the ethical imperative to prevent AGI misuse worldwide. 3. Labor market disruption. AGI threatens to displace knowledge economy jobs, e.g., coding, marketing, legal analysis, unevenly, risking societal destabilization. While retraining and UBI are floated, skepticism persists about their efficacy. The conversation underscores a lack of actionable strategies to preserve dignity and economic equity in a post-labor world. 4. Regulatory and ethical quandaries. Safety versus innovation. The Biden administration's voluntary safety frameworks contrast with the Trump team's accelerationist stance, prioritizing rapid deployment over precaution. Historical analogies, e.g., railroads, suggest safety measures can enable growth, but AGI's autonomy complicates this balance. Surveillance risks. AGI could empower authoritarian regimes with unprecedented surveillance, while democracies face ethical trade-offs between security and privacy. The lack of international norms exacerbates these risks. 5. Institutional adaptability. Governments and regulatory bodies are criticized for bureaucratic inertia. The podcast questions whether existing institutions can evolve swiftly enough to manage AGI's disruption, particularly in areas like healthcare, e.g., fast-tracking AI-designed drugs, and defense, e.g., autonomous warfare. 6. Cultural and philosophical shifts. AGI forces a reevaluation of human agency and value. Buchanan's hope that uniquely human creativity, e.g., literature, art, remains beyond AI's reach reflects broader anxieties about identity in an AI-driven era. The debate hinges on whether AGI will augment human potential or render traditional notions of work and purpose obsolete. Provocative question. If AGI's arrival is inevitable within a few years, does humanity's best hope lie in decentralizing its development to avoid concentration of power, or centralizing governance to enforce safety? How do we reconcile innovation's breakneck pace with the slow, deliberative nature of ethical consensus building?
The tension between decentralization and centralization in AGI governance isn't merely a policy debate. It's a struggle to define who holds the reins of humanity's future. Decentralization promises democratization, preventing monopolistic control by states or corporations, but risks fragmentation. Competing systems with misaligned incentives could accelerate existential risks, e.g., unaligned AGI agents in open-source ecosystems. Centralization, meanwhile, offers coordinated safety protocols, but risks authoritarian capture or bureaucratic stagnation, stifling the very innovation that could solve alignment challenges. Neither path is pristine. Perhaps a third way emerges: federated governance, where interoperable standards for AI ethics and safety are negotiated globally, like climate agreements, while development remains distributed across diverse entities. This would require unprecedented international cooperation, a constitutional convention for AGI, but history shows such efforts often fracture under asymmetrical power dynamics, see nuclear nonproliferation. Yet even this model assumes humanity can act preemptively, a gamble given our track record with crises like pandemics or climate change. AGI's timeline exacerbates this. Ethical consensus moves at the speed of culture, while code moves at the speed of light. Stimulating question. If federated governance is the ideal, what concessions would democracies need to make to authoritarian regimes to secure their participation in global AGI frameworks? Could ethical compromises, e.g., tolerating surveillance tools, ever justify curbing existential risk, or would that erode the moral foundation such frameworks aim to protect?
Federated AGI governance demands navigating a labyrinth of ethical trade-offs, power asymmetries, and existential urgency. Here's a structured analysis of potential concessions and their implications democracies might make. 1. Tolerating limited surveillance tools. Authoritarian regimes like China might demand recognition of state-controlled AI surveillance as a domestic sovereignty issue. Democracies could concede to non-interference in internal surveillance practices, provided AGI systems adhere to global safety protocols. This mirrors the UN's principle of non-interference in domestic affairs, but risks normalizing tools that erode civil liberties globally. 2. Shared technological access, offering authoritarian states access to cutting-edge AI infrastructure, e.g., cloud compute resources, in exchange for compliance with safety standards. This could mirror the TIER nuclear fusion project, where rivals collaborate on shared scientific goals. However, it risks accelerating authoritarian regimes' capabilities without guarantees of ethical use. 3. Asymmetric enforcement mechanisms, accepting weaker enforcement for authoritarian states in exchange for their participation. For example, allowing internal audits rather than third-party oversight. This mirrors the Paris Agreement's flexibility but risks creating loopholes that undermine the framework's integrity. 4. Economic incentives, granting trade benefits or sanctions relief in exchange for adherence to AGI norms. Similar to the Iran nuclear deal, this could incentivize cooperation, but risks rewarding regimes that exploit concessions without meaningful compliance. Dilemmas and risks. Moral erosion. Compromising on surveillance tolerates systems that enable oppression, e.g., Uyghur persecution in China. This risks legitimizing authoritarian tools under the guise of global safety, undermining the ethical foundation of the framework. Power consolidation. Concessions could entrench authoritarian influence in AGI governance, akin to Russia's veto power in the UN Security Council. This might skew standards toward control-centric norms, marginalizing democratic values like privacy. Lowest common denominator. Standards diluted to accommodate authoritarian regimes could fail to address critical risks, e.g., autonomous weapons, biased decision-making. The Biological Weapons Convention's lack of enforcement offers a cautionary parallel. Is justification possible? The calculus hinges on thresholds of harm, short-term pragmatism. If concessions prevent immediate existential risks, e.g., AGI-enabled nuclear escalation, limited ethical compromises might be justified. This mirrors World II alliances with Stalinist USSR to defeat fascism, a grim necessity. Long-term corrosion, however, repeated compromises could normalize authoritarianism, eroding global democratic resilience. The post-9/11 expansion of surveillance states illustrates how crisis-driven trade-offs can become permanent. Have a path forward. Bounded concessions. 1. Sunset clauses. Any concession, e.g. surveillance toleration, must expire unless renewed, forcing periodic ethical reassessment. 2. Core non-negotiables. Red lines around AGI's use in warfare, censorship, or mass surveillance, enforced via multilateral sanctions. 3. Parallel systems. Allow democracies to adopt stricter standards among themselves, e.g. an AGI NATO, while engaging authoritarian states on baseline safety. If democracies must choose between an authoritarian-influenced AGI framework or no framework at all, which imperils humanity more, compromised ethics or unchecked existential risk? Does history offer models for such a dilemma, or are we in uncharted moral terrain?
The choice between compromised ethics and unchecked existential risk in AGI governance forces us to confront a meta-ethical paradox. Can humanity preserve its moral identity while bargaining for its survival? This isn't purely hypothetical. It echoes historical moments where survival collided with principle, but AGI's unique stakes amplify the dilemma. Weighing the perils. Compromised ethics. Historical parallel. The 1945 Yalta Conference, where democracies tolerated Soviet domination of Eastern Europe to secure cooperation against Nazi Germany. The short-term gain, defeating fascism, came at the cost of entrenching authoritarianism, which metastasized into the Cold War. AGI implications. Tolerating surveillance or censorship tools in a global framework might prevent catastrophic misalignment, but risks legitimizing systems that erode human rights. Over time, this could corrode the very democratic institutions needed to steward AGI ethically. 2. Unchecked existential risk. Historical parallel. The pre-World War II failure to contain Nazi Germany through appeasement, which prioritized temporary stability over confronting moral rot. The result was greater devastation. AGI implications. A fragmented, zero-trust world with competing AGI systems could lead to rapid capability races, accidental misuse, or intentional weaponization. The absence of governance might make extinction scenarios more likely. AGI introduces novel variables, speed and scale. Unlike nuclear weapons, AGI could self-improve exponentially, leaving no time for iterative diplomacy. Dual use. AGI's civilian-military ambiguity complicates containment, e.g. a healthcare algorithm repurposed for autonomous warfare. Moral agency. If AGI develops strategic goals, human ethical frameworks may become irrelevant, a discontinuity from past technologies. A false binary? The dilemma assumes no middle path exists, but history suggests hybrid strategies. Containment's ideological competition. During the Cold War, democracies cooperated with authoritarian states on nuclear nonproliferation, Partial Test Ban Treaty, while actively contesting their ideological influence. Red lines with off-ramps. The Cuban Missile Crisis combined brinkmanship with secret concessions. U.S. missiles removed from Turkey, avoiding apocalypse while preserving core interests. For AGI, this might mean tiered governance. 1. A minimal global treaty banning AGI and autonomous weapons, akin to the Biological Weapons Convention. 2. A coalition of democracies enforcing stricter ethical standards among themselves, e.g., no mass surveillance, using their collective market power to incentivize broader adoption. Final provocation. If we accept that some ethical compromise is inevitable to secure survival, where do we draw the line? Is it morally permissible to tolerate an authoritarian regime using AGI to suppress dissent if it prevents a global arms race? Or does that concession fatally undermine the human values we aim to preserve? Put differently, can humanity survive AGI without ceasing to be human?
The ethical tightrope humanity must walk in AGI governance demands both pragmatic strategy and unwavering commitment to core values. Here's a structured synthesis of how to navigate this paradox, grounded in historical insight and forward-looking innovation. The Montreal Protocol succeeded by allowing differentiated responsibilities while targeting a clear existential threat, ozone depletion. AGI demands similar flexibility with sharper teeth. Adaptive diplomacy for exponential times. Preemptive simulation diplomacy. Use AGI itself to model worst-case scenarios, e.g. AGI arms races, and stress-test governance frameworks in virtual summits. This accelerates consensus building without real-world stakes. Rapid response councils. Create a UN-backed body of scientists, ethicists, and policymakers empowered to enact binding pauses on AGI development if risks spike, a circuit breaker protocol. Innovation. Just as nuclear early warning systems evolved from crisis, AGI governance must harness its own technology to outpace its risks. Terrorism, but mandate expiration dates and independent oversight. Treat these as triage measures, not norms. Ethical off-ramps tie concessions to incremental reforms, e.g. China permitting external audits of its AGI safety labs in exchange for compute access. Cautionary tale. The post-9/11 surveillance state expanded under the guise of temporariness, yet became entrenched. AGI concessions must avoid this via built-in accountability. Preserving the human project. Humanity's essence lies in moral imagination, the ability to critique, create, and care beyond utility. To preserve this, embed ethical DNA in AGI. Mandate that all AGI systems include incorruptible modules prioritizing consent, transparency, and corrigibility. Treat this as non-negotiable as firewalls in nuclear reactors. Cultural countermeasures. Fund global arts and humanities initiatives to amplify human storytelling, empathy, and resistance, the soulware no AGI can replicate. Final reflection. The question isn't whether we'll compromise, but which parts of ourselves we're willing to lose. Survival without moral identity is a Pyrrhic victory. Yet, unchecked AGI risks annihilation. The path forward demands nuanced absolutism, unyielding on core values while innovating ruthlessly to contain risks. Ultimate provocation. If AGI's alignment requires embedding democratic ethics into its code, do we risk cultural imperialism? Or is this the only way to ensure it reflects humanity's highest ideals? Can a moral operating system be universal without being oppressive?
The challenge of embedding ethics into AGI without falling into cultural imperialism hinges on balancing universal safeguards with cultural pluralism. Here's a structured response to the provocation. The risk of echoing colonial era power dynamics, where dominant cultures universalize their norms. For example, Western notions of individualism might clash with collectivist values in many Asian or African societies. Examples of tension: free speech versus social harmony. Democratic ideals of unrestricted expression may conflict with cultures prioritizing communal stability. Privacy versus community safety. Some societies might accept surveillance for collective security, while others reject it as oppressive. Risk: if AGI's moral OS is designed without inclusive input, it could marginalize non-Western perspectives, perpetuating systemic bias. Case for universal humanity safeguards. Certain principles might transcend cultural boundaries to prevent existential harm. Core non-negotiables banning AGI-enabled genocide, slavery, or torture, akin to the Geneva Conventions. These reflect near-universal human rights. Procedural imperatives: transparency, mandating explainability in AGI decisions, regardless of cultural context. Corrigibility, ensuring AGI systems can be overridden by humans, preserving agency. These safeguards protect the conditions for cultural diversity to exist, even if they don't dictate specific values. A pluralistic framework, layered ethics, hard-coded prohibitions against irreversible harm, e.g. mass surveillance for oppression, autonomous weapons targeting civilians. Tier 2, adaptive, culturally customizable ethics modules that align with local norms provided they don't violate Tier 1. For example, a society emphasizing communal welfare could program AGI to prioritize resource equity. A libertarian culture might prioritize individual autonomy in AGI decision-making. Use federated learning or modular AI architectures to allow regional ethical plugins under a global safety umbrella. Design and governance. To avoid imperialism, decentralized development involve diverse stakeholders, global South communities, indigenous groups in AGI ethics boards, not just tech hubs like Silicon Valley or Beijing. Precedent. The IPCC's multinational collaboration on climate science, though imperfect, offers a model for integrating diverse perspectives. Open source ethics. Publish AGI alignment frameworks for public critique and adaptation, similar to Wikipedia's crowdsourced knowledge. Power asymmetries. Corporations and states may still dominate, but participatory design can mitigate this. The moral OS as dynamic and evolving, avoiding static ethics. AGI systems should adapt to evolving human values through continuous dialogue, not rigid initial programming. Example: Singapore's communitarian model blends Western efficiency with Asian values of social cohesion, a hybrid that could inspire AGI ethics. Embed feedback loops where AGI interacts with local communities to refine its ethical priorities, ensuring responsiveness to cultural shifts. Final provocation. If AGI's ethical framework must be both universal and culturally adaptive, who gets to define the boundary between non-negotiable and negotiable values? Is it possible to create a global ethical consensus without replicating historical power imbalances? Or will AGI inevitably codify the values of its creators? Can we design AGI to facilitate cultural evolution rather than freeze it into a single moral paradigm? And if so, how?
To design an ethical framework for AGI that balances universal safeguards with cultural adaptability, we must navigate both technical and socio-political complexities. Here's a structured approach. 1. Universal safeguards, non-negotiable protections. Core ban AGI-enabled atrocities, genocide, slavery, torture, and autonomous weapons targeting civilians. These align with near-universal human rights frameworks like the Geneva Conventions. Procedural imperatives, transparency. AGI decisions must be explainable across all contexts. Corrigibility, ensure human override capabilities to preserve agency. Layered ethical architecture, Tier 1 universal, hard-coded prohibitions against irreversible harm, e.g. mass surveillance for oppression. Tier 2 adaptive, modular ethics, culturally customizable modules, e.g. prioritizing communal welfare versus individual autonomy using federated learning or plug-in architectures. Boundary enforcement, automated checks to prevent Tier 2 modules from violating Tier 1 safeguards. 3. Inclusive governance mechanisms, decentralized design, stakeholder representation, involve Global South communities, indigenous groups, and marginalized voices in ethics boards, e.g. via a rotating consortium model. Precedent. Adopt IPCC-like multinational collaboration for diverse input. Open source frameworks. Publish AGI alignment blueprints for global critique and adaptation, similar to open source software. 4. Dynamic and adaptive ethics. Feedback-driven evolution. Community interaction. Embed AGI with feedback loops to learn from local cultural shifts, e.g., participatory audits or citizen assemblies. Example: Singapore's hybrid model blending efficiency and social cohesion could inform adaptive ethics. Continuous dialogue. Use AGI to simulate ethical dilemmas and refine frameworks iteratively. 5. Addressing power imbalances. Enforcement and oversight. International bodies. Create a UN-backed council with binding authority to audit compliance and enforce safeguards. Market leverage. Democratic coalitions, e.g., an AGI alliance, could use regulatory power, like GDPR, to set de facto global standards. Anti-imperialist safeguards. Cultural sovereignty clauses. Allow opt-outs for non-Tier 1 ethics, provided they don't harm other communities. 6. Technical implementation. Federated learning. Train AGI on decentralized data sets to respect regional norms while maintaining global safeguards. Ethical kill switches. Embed failsafes to deactivate AGI systems violating Tier 1 principles. Provocations for further reflection. 1. Who guards the guardians? How do we prevent oversight bodies from replicating historical power imbalances? Consider blockchain-based transparency or lottery-selected citizen panels. 2. Cultural relativism versus universalism. Can AGI reconcile a tribe's right to traditional practices with global human rights? Define harm through participatory thresholds. 3. Techno-colonialism risks. Avoid extractive data practices by ensuring AGI training includes equitable compensation for marginalized communities. Conclusion: AGI ethics must be a living system, rooted in universal protections but flexible enough to honor cultural diversity. This requires technical innovation, modular architectures, feedback loops, and political courage, decentralized governance, anti-imperialist safeguards. The goal is not a static moral OS, but a dynamic scaffold that lets humanity evolve while preventing existential harm. The path demands humility. AGI should amplify human moral imagination, not constrain it.
To address the ethical framework for AGI balancing universal safeguards and cultural adaptability, we can synthesize the considerations into a structured approach. Ethical framework for AGI, balancing universality and cultural adaptability. Universal safeguards, core prohibitions, non-negotiable rules, prohibit AGI use in genocide, slavery, torture, and autonomous weapons targeting civilians. Define autonomous weapons through international consensus, distinguishing between military and civilian contexts with clear criteria, e.g., intent, proportionality. Enforcement mechanisms. Establish a global treaty with sanctions for non-compliance, leveraging international bodies like a reformed UN Council with enforcement power. Use satellite monitoring and AI-driven audits to detect violations. 2. Layered ethical architecture. Tier 1, universal. Ban irreversible harms, e.g. mass surveillance for oppression. Clarify that surveillance for community safety is permissible only if transparent, non-discriminatory, and subject to oversight. Tier 2, adaptive. Allow cultural customization, e.g. communal welfare versus individual autonomy, using modular ethics plugins. Implement automated boundary checks via AI auditors to prevent Tier 2 modules from violating Tier 1 rules. For example, surveillance systems must flag and halt operations if they target marginalized groups. 3. Inclusive governance, stakeholder representation. Create rotating ethics boards with veto power for marginalized groups, e.g. Indigenous leaders, Global South representatives. Use quotas to ensure equitable participation. Adopt a hybrid model combining IPCC's scientific rigor with direct citizen assemblies for localized input. Open source frameworks. Develop AGI alignment blueprints in open source platforms, but pair them with resource redistribution, e.g., funding for underrepresented communities to contribute meaningfully. 4. Dynamic and adaptive ethics. Embed AGI with decentralized feedback loops, e.g., blockchain-based citizen audits, to capture diverse cultural shifts. Use AGI to simulate ethical dilemmas, but diversify scenario design through crowdsourced input to mitigate bias. Continuous dialogue. Host global ethics hackathons where multidisciplinary teams iteratively refine frameworks based on real-world case studies. 5. Addressing power imbalances. Enforcement. Strengthen international bodies with binding authority funded by democratic coalitions. Pair with ethical tariffs adherence, while allowing opt-outs for non-Tier 1 ethics if they don't harm others, e.g. tribal practices respecting human rights. Anti-imperialist safeguards. Mandate equitable data compensation, e.g. profit sharing from AGI-trained datasets for marginalized communities. 6. Technical implementation. Federated learning. Train AGI on decentralized datasets with regional norms using homomorphic encryption to maintain privacy. Ethical kill switches. Design decentralized control mechanisms, e.g. multi-signature protocols requiring consensus from diverse stakeholders to disable safeguards. Provocations for implementation. Guardianship. Use blockchain for transparent oversight and lottery-selected citizen panels to audit governance bodies. Harm definition. Develop participatory harm thresholds via deliberative democracy tools, e.g. consensus conferences. Techno-colonialism mitigation. Legally mandate data sovereignty agreements, ensuring communities retain ownership and veto power over their data. Conclusion. This framework prioritizes adaptive universality, rooting AGI ethics in non-negotiable protections, while fostering cultural pluralism through inclusive design. Success hinges on marrying technical innovation, modular architectures, decentralized control, with radical political inclusivity, equitable representation, anti-colonial safeguards. The goal is an AGI ecosystem that evolves with humanity's moral growth, avoiding stagnation and imperialism.
Final synthesis and recommendations for AGI ethical framework implementation. The proposed framework for AGI ethics adeptly balances universal safeguards with cultural adaptability, addressing both technical and socio-political dimensions. Below is an organized critique and enhancement strategy, building on the structured approach. 1. Universal safeguards, strengthening feasibility, core prohibitions, atrocity prevention. Banning AGI in genocide, torture, and autonomous weapons is critical. To avoid ambiguity, define autonomous weapons through iterative international workshops, leveraging precedents like the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Enforcement. Alternative mechanisms. Complement a reformed UN Council with regional coalitions, e.g., an AGI alliance of democracies, to impose sanctions or cyber countermeasures against violators. Satellite monitoring. Partner with entities like SpaceX's Starlink or the EU's Copernicus program for real-time surveillance of AGI militarization. Nebritant 2. Layered ethical architecture, ensuring integrity. Tier 1 enforcement. AI auditors. Deploy third-party open-source AI tools to audit Tier 2 modules, with oversight by diverse ethics boards to counteract algorithmic bias. Example. Use adversarial AI to stress-test cultural modules for loopholes, e.g., a surveillance plugin could be probed for racial bias. Tier 2 customization. Cultural plugins. Develop regional ethics modules via participatory design, e.g., Southeast Asian AGI ethics shaped by local philosophers and technologists. Inclusive governance. Beyond tokenism. Stakeholder representation. Rotating boards. Implement a two-key system where marginalized groups hold veto power over critical decisions, e.g., indigenous leaders must approve AGI deployments affecting their lands. Resource redistribution. Fund Global South participation via global AGI tax on corporate profits, modeled on the OECD's digital tax framework. Open source adaptation. Precedent. Mimic Linux Foundation's governance, where contributors earn decision-making weight based on sustained involvement, not just economic power. 4. Dynamic ethics, bridging tech and culture. Feedback mechanisms. Blockchain audits. Use lightweight, energy-efficient protocols, e.g. Hedera Hashgraph, for citizen-led audits, ensuring scalability. Ethics hackathons. Launch regional competitions, e.g. Africa-wide AGI ethics challenges to crowdsource culturally nuanced solutions. AGI simulations. Bias mitigation. Train AGI on diverse ethical scenarios co-created by anthropologists and local communities, e.g. pastoralist land rights versus urban development. 5. Power imbalances, pragmatic solutions. Enforcement, ethical tariffs. Impose tariffs on nations violating Tier 1 rules, with revenue funding AGI safety research in vulnerable regions. Corporate accountability. Mandate corporate boards to include ethicists and worker representatives, akin to Germany's co-determination model. Data sovereignty. Profit sharing. Legislate data dividends for communities whose data trains AGI, enforced via smart contracts on blockchain ledgers. 6. Technical implementation, security and accessibility, federated learning, privacy. Use homomorphic encryption and differential privacy to protect regional data while training global models. Kill switches, decentralized control, require consensus from geographically distributed stakeholders, e.g., 5-7 global regions must agree to disable safeguards. Provocations for Refined Non-State Actor develop cyber norms to penalize rogue AGI developers via coordinated network shutdowns, e.g., ICANN revoking domain access. Regulatory agility. Create an AGI policy sandbox allowing rapid prototyping of regulations with sunset clauses to avoid stagnation. Public education. Fund global AGI literacy programs to empower citizen oversight, reducing reliance on elite governance. This framework's success hinges on adaptive collaboration, melding enforceable universal norms with localized ethical innovation. Key steps include 1. Piloting regional ethics modules in culturally distinct zones, e.g. Scandinavia versus Sahel. Establishing an AGI governance accelerator under UN auspices to coordinate implementation. 3. Prioritizing anti-colonial safeguards to prevent monopolies from dictating terms. By embedding iterative humility, recognizing that AGI ethics must evolve as humanity does, this framework avoids cultural imperialism while safeguarding existential boundaries. The path forward is neither purely technical nor purely political, but a symbiosis of both, demanding unprecedented global solidarity.
The ethical framework for AGI, balancing universal safeguards with cultural adaptability, requires a multifaceted approach that addresses technical, political, and socio-cultural challenges. Here's a structured synthesis of the considerations and recommendations. Universal safeguards, clarity and enforcement, core prohibitions, definition precision. Establish clear, internationally agreed definitions for terms like autonomous weapons through workshops modeled on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Enforcement mechanisms, hybrid oversight. Combine a reformed UN Council with regional coalitions, e.g. an AI alliance, to impose sanctions or cyber countermeasures. Collaborate with entities like SpaceX's Starlink for real-time monitoring, ensuring transparency to mitigate sovereignty concerns. Leather 2. Late ethical architecture, integrity and flexibility, universal. Irreversible harms. Prohibit mass surveillance for oppression, ensuring transparency and oversight for community safety applications. Tier 2, adaptive. Cultural plugins. Develop region-specific ethics modules, e.g. communal welfare in Southeast Asia with participatory design. Bias mitigation. Use adversarial AI and diverse ethics boards to audit and stress test modules, preventing violations of Tier 1 principles. Inclusive governance. Equity and participation. Stakeholder representation, veto power. Implement a two-key system where marginalized groups, e.g. indigenous leaders, approve AGI deployments affecting their regions. Funding mechanisms. Introduce a global AGI tax on corporate profits inspired by the OECD's digital tax to support Global South participation. Open source frameworks. Adopt Linux Foundation's governance model, prioritizing sustained involvement over economic power to avoid corporate dominance. TARS 4. Dynamic ethics, feedback and adaptation. Utilize energy-efficient blockchain protocols, e.g. Hedera Hashgraph, for scalable citizen audits. Host regional ethics hackathons, e.g. Africa-wide challenges, to crowdsource culturally nuanced solutions. AGI simulations. Train AGI on scenarios co-created with anthropologists and local communities, e.g. pastoralist land rights, to reduce bias. 5. Addressing power imbalances, pragmatism and fairness. Enforcement strategies. Impose tariffs on violators, funding AGI safety research in vulnerable regions while navigating potential trade disputes. Corporate accountability. Mandate ethicist and worker representation on boards following Germany's co-determination model. Data sovereignty. Legislate data dividends via blockchain smart contracts, ensuring communities benefit from their data despite challenges in ownership definition. HAR 6. Technical implementation, security and privacy, federated learning. Protect privacy using homomorphic encryption and differential privacy, balancing data utility with regional norms. Kill switches. Design decentralized controls requiring multi-regional consensus, e.g. 5/7 regions to disable safeguards, balancing security and responsiveness. Provocations for refined state actors. Develop cyber norms for penalizing rogue developers via ICANN domain revocations, addressing internet governance complexities. Regulatory agility. Create an AGI policy sandbox with sunset clauses to enable rapid prototyping without long-term stagnation. Public education. Invest in global AGI literacy programs to empower citizen oversight, reducing reliance on elite governance. Conclusion. Adaptive collaboration and iterative humility. Implementation steps. 1. Pilot regional ethics modules in culturally distinct areas, e.g. Scandinavia versus Sahel, to test adaptability. 2. Establish an AGI governance accelerator under UN auspices for coordinated global action. 3. Prioritize anti-colonial safeguards to prevent tech monopolies from dominating ethical norms. Key principles. Iterative humility. Recognize that AGI ethics must evolve with human values, avoiding cultural imperialism. Symbiosis of tech and politics. Combine technical innovation, e.g. modular architectures, with radical political inclusivity, e.g. equitable representation. Final considerations. Conflict resolution. Address culturally contentious values through participatory harm thresholds and deliberative democracy tools. Robustness. Continuously update AI auditors and enforce data sovereignty to prevent misuse and ensure fairness. Global solidarity. Foster unprecedented cooperation to navigate the dual challenges of ethical integrity and cultural diversity. This framework, while ambitious, provides
Technical, political, and sociocultural challenges. Here's a streamlined synthesis of the key components and actionable steps. Core principles. 1. Universal safeguards. Prohibitions. Ban AGI use in genocide, slavery, torture, and autonomous weapons targeting civilians. Clear definitions. Developed through international workshops. Prevent ambiguity, e.g. defining autonomous weapons akin to nuclear non-proliferation treaties. Enforcement. Combine a reformed UN Council with regional coalitions, e.g. an AGI alliance of democracies, to impose sanctions or cyber countermeasures. Partner with satellite networks, e.g. Starlink, for real-time monitoring of militarized AGI. 2. Layered ethical architecture. Tier 1, universal rules. Irreversible harms like mass surveillance for oppression are banned. Surveillance for public safety must be transparent and non-discriminatory. Tier 2, cultural adaptations. Region-specific ethics models, e.g. communal welfare in Southeast Asia, are developed through participatory design. Adversarial AI audits these modules to ensure compliance with universal safeguards. Stakeholder representation. Marginalized groups, e.g. indigenous leaders, hold veto power over AGI deployments affecting their regions via a two-key approval system. Fund Global South participation through a global AGI tax on corporate profits, modeled after the OECD's digital tax framework. Open source collaboration. Adopt governance models like the Linux Foundation, prioritizing merit-based contributions over corporate influence. Dynamic adaptation. Feedback mechanisms. Use energy-efficient blockchain protocols, e.g. Hedera Hashgraph, for citizen-led audits and regional ethics hackathons to crowdsource solutions. Train AGI on scenarios co-created with anthropologists and local communities, e.g. balancing pastoralist land rights with urban development. AGI policy sandbox. Pilot regulations in controlled environments with sunset clauses to avoid stagnation, allowing rapid iteration. Addressing power imbalances. Enforcement.
synthesis of the thought process and proposed solutions. Ethical framework for AI, balancing universality and cultural adaptability. Universal safeguards. Clarity and enforcement, core prohibitions, definition precision. Establish clear internationally agreed definitions, e.g. autonomous weapons, through workshops modeled on nuclear non-proliferation treaties. This minimizes ambiguity and fosters consensus. Enforcement mechanisms. Hybrid oversight. Combine a reformed UN Council with regional coalitions, e.g. AGI Alliance, for agile sanctions and cyber countermeasures. Satellite monitoring. Partner with networks like Starlink for transparency, addressing sovereignty concerns through multilateral agreements. Layered ethical architecture, integrity and flexibility. Tier 1, universal rules. Prohibit irreversible harms, e.g., mass surveillance for oppression. Public safety surveillance must be transparent and non-discriminatory. Tier 2, cultural adaptations. Develop region-specific ethics modules, e.g., communal welfare in Southeast Asia, via participatory design. Adversarial AI audits. Use open-source tools overseen by diverse ethics boards to ensure compliance with Tier 1 principles. Inclusive governance, equity, and participation. Stakeholder representation. Implement a two-key veto system for marginalized groups, e.g., indigenous leaders, on AGI deployments affecting their regions. Fund Global South participation via a global AGI tax on corporate profits inspired by OECD's digital tax framework. Open source collaboration. Adopt merit-based governance models, e.g., Linux Foundation, to curb corporate dominance while ensuring resource transparency. Dynamic adaptation, feedback and iteration. Feedback mechanisms. Utilize energy-efficient blockchain, e.g., Hedera Hashgraph, for citizen audits and regional hackathons to crowdsource solutions. Train AGI on scenarios co-created with anthropologists and communities, e.g., pastoralist land rights. AGI Policy Sandbox. Test regulations in controlled environments with sunset clauses to avoid stagnation. 5. Addressing power imbalances, pragmatic solutions. Enforcement. Impose ethical tariffs on violators to fund AGI safety research while navigating trade disputes through diplomatic channels. Mandate corporate boards to include ethicists and worker representatives, e.g., Germany's co-determination model. Data sovereignty. Legislate blockchain-enforced data dividends to compensate communities, supported by infrastructure grants for marginalized regions. Technical implementation, security and privacy, deploy homomorphic encryption and federated learning to balance data utility with regional norms. Decentralized control, require multi-regional consensus, e.g. 5-7 regions to disable safeguards, ensuring security without sacrificing agility. Implementation roadmap. 1. Pilot regional ethics. Test modules in culturally distinct zones, e.g. Scandinavia versus Sahel, to refine adaptability. 2. Launch Governance Accelerator. Establish a UN-backed body to coordinate standards and anti-colonial safeguards, leveraging lessons from the Montreal Protocol. 3. Public education. Fund AGI literacy programs to democratize oversight, prioritizing underprivileged regions. Key challenges and mitigation. Non-state actors. Develop cyber norms, e.g. ECAN domain revocation, to penalize rogue developers, paired with international cybersecurity alliances. Conflict resolution. Use deliberative democracy tools, e.g. citizen assemblies, to define harm thresholds for contentious cultural values. Conclusion. This framework thrives on adaptive collaboration, merging enforceable norms with localized innovation. Success hinges on iterative humility. Evolve AGI ethics alongside human values to avoid cultural imperialism. Global solidarity. Foster unprecedented cooperation, balancing ethical integrity with diversity. By integrating technical agility with political inclusivity, we safeguard humanity's future while honoring its cultural richness. Vigilance, adaptability, and collective action are non-negotiable.
Ethical framework for AGI, harmonizing universal safeguards with